The morning sun painted the cracked asphalt in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers reaching for something lost. Kestrel crouched behind the rusted shell of what had once been a school bus, its yellow paint now peeling away like diseased skin. Through the broken windows, she could see the shambling forms moving through the abandoned town square, their movements erratic and purposeless, like marionettes with severed strings. How many? Thorn's voice was barely a whisper, his breath warm against her ear. She could smell the staleness of their last meal on him, canned beans eaten cold 3 days ago. His dark eyes, once bright with dreams of becoming a teacher, now held only the calculating hardness of survival. Kestrel held up 7 fingers, then paused and added 2 more. 9 of them, wandering aimlessly through what had been Millbrook's town center. She remembered this place from before, the Saturday farmers' markets, children laughing as they chased each other around the old oak tree that now stood leafless and broken. The tree's branches reached skyward like arthritic hands, and she wondered if it mourned the children who would never play in its shade again. Behind them, young Amaranth shifted restlessly, her backpack creating small scraping sounds against the concrete. At 15, she had never known the world as it was, only as it had become. Sometimes Kestrel envied her that ignorance, but mostly she pitied her for all the beautiful ordinary moments she would never experience. Amaranth had never stood in line at a coffee shop, complaining about being late for work. She had never known the luxury of boredom. "We could go around," Cicero suggested from his position near the rear of their small group. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had seen too much change too quickly. He had been a banker before, spending his days in air-conditioned offices, worried about interest rates and mortgage approvals. Now he worried about whether they had enough ammunition to last another week. Kestrel studied the infected wandering through the square. They moved with the terrible patience of the dead, occasionally bumping into each other or the few remaining storefronts, but otherwise content to exist in their endless, mindless loop. She recognized one of them, Mrs. Chen, who had run the bakery on Elm Street. The woman's floral dress was now stained with substances Kestrel didn't want to identify, and her face bore the characteristic gray pallor and milky eyes of the turned. But even in death, she moved toward the spot where her bakery had stood, drawn by some phantom memory of purpose. "Going around adds 2 days to our journey," Senna said quietly. She was checking her rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit that had developed since they'd lost Marcus to a horde outside Portland. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, and Kestrel noticed how her wedding ring caught the light. Senna still wore it, though her husband had been gone for over a year now. Some ghosts were harder to abandon than others. The infected weren't their only concern. Food was running low, and winter was approaching with the inevitability of death itself. They needed to reach the rumored safe zone in Colorado before the first snows made travel impossible. Every delay brought them closer to a cold, hungry death that might be worse than what the infected offered. Kestrel closed her eyes and tried to remember what this journey had been like in the before times. A simple drive from Oregon to Colorado, maybe 10 hours with stops for gas and fast food. Now it was an odyssey through a landscape of abandoned dreams and walking nightmares, where every mile was earned through blood and terror. The roads they traveled now were arteries in a dead body, leading them through the corpse of civilization toward an uncertain salvation. When she opened her eyes, one of the infected had turned in their direction. The infected woman, what had once been Mrs. Chen, tilted her head like a curious bird, her milky eyes scanning the area where they hid. Kestrel felt her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat seeming loud enough to echo off the empty buildings. The woman's mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth stained dark with old blood, and her neck bore the telltale bite marks that had sealed her fate months ago. Beside her, Thorn's hand moved slowly to the knife at his belt. They all knew the rules by now: noise was death, gunshots were dinner bells for every infected within miles. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes the dead found you anyway, drawn by instincts that death hadn't quite managed to erase. Mrs. Chen took a step toward their hiding spot, then another. Her feet shuffled against the broken pavement, scraping like sandpaper against wood. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness, and Kestrel found herself holding her breath until her lungs burned. Behind them, she could hear Amaranth's quiet, panicked breathing, and she wanted to turn and offer comfort, but she didn't dare move. The infected woman stopped barely 10 feet away, swaying slightly as if buffeted by invisible winds. For a moment that stretched like hours, she simply stood there, and Kestrel wondered what thoughts, if any, moved through her diseased mind. Did she remember the smell of fresh bread and the satisfaction of a successful batch of croissants? Did some fragment of her former self recognize this place as home? Then Mrs. Chen turned away, shuffling back toward the town square with the same aimless purpose that had driven her there in the first place. Kestrel released her breath in a slow, controlled stream, watching as the infected woman rejoined the slow parade of the dead. "We wait until they move on," Thorn whispered, his voice barely audible. But Kestrel shook her head. She had been watching the infected for the past hour, and they showed no signs of leaving. If anything, they seemed anchored to this place, drawn by memories that even death couldn't completely destroy. "They're not going anywhere," she murmured back. "This is their territory now." Cicero shifted his weight, and she could practically hear him thinking, calculating risks and probabilities with the same methodical approach he had once applied to loan applications. "The service road behind Miller's Hardware," he said finally. "If we're quiet, we might be able to slip past without drawing attention." Senna nodded, but her expression remained troubled. She was studying the infected with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. "They're different here," she said softly. "More organized. Like they're following some kind of pattern." Kestrel had noticed it too. In other towns, the infected wandered randomly, driven by base hunger and simple stimulus response. But these 9 moved in a rough circle around the town square, as if they were performing some parody of their former lives. Mrs. Chen gravitated toward where her bakery had been, while the infected man in the postal uniform kept returning to the spot where the mailbox had stood. "Maybe they remember," Amaranth whispered, and there was something heartbreaking in her voice. The girl had never known these people in life, but she seemed to understand the tragedy of their undeath better than any of them. Maybe some part of them is still in there, trying to go home. The thought sent ice through Kestrel's veins. If the infected retained even fragments of their memories, their personalities, then every time they put one down, they weren't just destroying a monster, they were murdering what remained of a person. The weight of all the infected they had killed pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "We can't think like that," Thorn said firmly, though his voice carried its own note of uncertainty. "They're gone. What's left isn't them anymore." But as they prepared to move, creeping slowly toward the service road that would take them around the square, Kestrel caught sight of something that made her stomach clench. One of the infected, a young man in a varsity jacket, had stopped in front of what had been the ice cream shop. He stood there motionless, one decaying hand pressed against the broken window, and if she didn't know better, she would have sworn she saw longing in his posture. The roads they traveled now weren't just paths through a dead world, they were journeys through a cemetery of memories, where the ghosts of the past walked in borrowed flesh, forever seeking something they could never find again. The service road stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, cracked pavement giving way to weeds and wildflowers that had begun to reclaim the abandoned spaces. Kestrel led the way, placing each step with careful precision, while behind her the others followed in single file. The morning air carried the scent of decay and wild roses, a combination that made her stomach turn with its bitter irony. Obsidian's voice echoed in her memory as they walked, words spoken during their last radio contact 3 weeks ago. "The thing about hope is that it changes you, even when you don't want it to." He had been their communications specialist, coordinating supply drops and safe house locations from his mobile command post. Now his radio sat silent in their pack, and she didn't know if it was because his equipment had failed or because there was no one left to answer. They had made it 50 yards when Amaranth stumbled, her foot catching on a chunk of broken concrete. The metallic clatter of her canteen against the pavement rang out like a bell, and instantly every infected head in the town square turned in their direction. Kestrel felt her heart stop as 9 pairs of milky eyes fixed on their position with the focus of predators who had suddenly caught the scent of prey. "Run," Cicero breathed, but Kestrel was already moving. The infected broke into their shambling pursuit, their movements still awkward but filled with terrible purpose. Mrs. Chen led the pack, her floral dress billowing around her as she moved faster than any dead thing should be able to. Behind her, the young man in the varsity jacket had abandoned his vigil at the ice cream shop, his mouth open in a soundless moan of hunger. They sprinted down the service road, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders with each desperate step. Kestrel could hear Senna's labored breathing behind her, and she knew the older woman was struggling to keep up. They had all lost weight over the past months, but Senna had given up too many of her rations to keep Amaranth fed, and it showed in her hollow cheeks and the way her clothes hung loose on her frame. The road curved ahead, disappearing behind a stand of oak trees that had somehow survived the chaos. If they could reach that cover, they might be able to lose their pursuers in the underbrush. But the infected were gaining ground, their relentless pace eating up the distance between them with mechanical efficiency. "The trees!" Thorn shouted, pointing ahead to where the road vanished into shadow. But as they rounded the curve, Kestrel's heart sank. The path ahead was blocked by an overturned semi-truck, its trailer jackknifed across the roadway like a metal wall. Rust stains and bullet holes told the story of its final moments, and she could see bones scattered in the cab, the last desperate stand of a driver who had tried to make it home. "This way," Cicero called, veering off the road and into the woods. They crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes and skin, while behind them the infected followed with single-minded determination. The dead didn't feel pain from thorns or exhaustion from running, they would follow until their prey escaped or collapsed. In the deeper woods, the canopy blocked out much of the sunlight, creating a twilight world of green shadows and muted sounds. Kestrel could hear water running somewhere ahead, a stream, maybe, that might mask their scent and sound. But she could also hear the infected crashing through the brush behind them, closer now, their ragged breathing like the sound of broken bellows. Amaranth was crying as she ran, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. The girl had grown up in this world, but the reality of being hunted never got easier. If anything, it seemed to affect her more deeply than the rest of them, as if her young mind couldn't fully accept the wrongness of it all. They burst through a wall of ferns and found themselves on the bank of a small creek, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. On the far side, the woods continued, offering the promise of deeper cover. But the water was waist-deep and moving fast, and Kestrel knew that Senna might not have the strength to fight the current. Behind them, the infected emerged from the trees like a nightmare-given form, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt and blood. Mrs. Chen's floral dress was now completely ruined, and the postal worker had lost his cap somewhere in the chase, revealing a scalp marked with deep bite wounds. "Across!" Kestrel shouted, plunging into the icy water. The current immediately tried to sweep her downstream, but she fought against it, using her hands to pull herself along the rocky bottom. Behind her, she could hear the others splashing into the stream, and then the wet, urgent sounds of the infected following them into the water. The dead, it seemed, didn't fear drowning any more than they feared thorns. The water rose to Kestrel's chest as she fought against the current, her fingers numb from the cold as she grasped for purchase on the slippery rocks beneath the surface. Behind her, she could hear Senna struggling, her breathing harsh and desperate as the creek tried to sweep her downstream. The infected had entered the water without hesitation, their bodies displacing it in dark, churning waves as they pressed forward with mechanical persistence. Thorn reached the far bank first, hauling himself up onto the muddy shore before turning to help Amaranth. The girl's face was pale with cold and fear, her lips already taking on a blue tinge that reminded Kestrel uncomfortably of the infected's pallor. As Thorn pulled Amaranth to safety, Kestrel grabbed Senna's arm and began dragging her toward the bank. "I can't," Senna gasped, her legs barely working beneath her. "Leave me. Take the others and go." "Like hell," Kestrel growled, wrapping her arm around Senna's waist and using her own body to fight the current. The infected were halfway across now, moving through the water with disturbing efficiency. Mrs. Chen's sodden dress clung to her decaying form, and her milky eyes never left Kestrel's face. There was something almost personal in that gaze, as if the infected woman remembered being abandoned by the living once before. Cicero appeared beside them in the water, his silver hair plastered to his skull as he took Senna's other arm. Together, they hauled her up the bank and into the shadows of the trees beyond. But the infected were emerging from the water now, their clothes streaming and their movements made even more grotesque by the way the creek water ran off them in dark rivulets. The old growth, Cicero panted, pointing deeper into the forest where massive Douglas firs created a cathedral of shadows, dense enough to slow them down. They ran again, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grow thicker with every step. Ancient trees towered above them, their trunks so wide that several people holding hands couldn't have encircled them. This was old forest, the kind that remembered when indigenous peoples had walked these paths, before the roads and towns and all the small civilizations that had risen and fallen in the space between then and now. Kestrel found herself thinking about time as they ran, about how quickly everything they had known could disappear. 2 years ago, she had been worried about her mortgage and whether she'd get promoted at the accounting firm. Now those concerns seemed as distant as childhood fairy tales, belonging to a person she barely recognized as herself. They found shelter in a hollow formed by the roots of a fallen giant, its massive trunk creating a natural wall against pursuit. Huddled in the dirt and decomposing leaves, they listened to the sounds of the infected searching for them, their movements growing more distant as they spread out through the forest. "They'll give up eventually," Thorn whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. "They always do." But Senna shook her head, water still dripping from her graying hair. "Not these ones. They're different. More focused." She paused, her eyes distant with some troubling thought. What if they're learning? The possibility hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. If the infected could adapt, could remember and plan, then everything they thought they knew about survival was wrong. The rules they had learned through blood and loss would become meaningless overnight. Amaranth was shivering violently, her wet clothes clinging to her thin frame. Kestrel pulled her close, sharing what warmth she could, and felt the girl's bones through her skin. They were all too thin now, burning through their reserves with each desperate flight from danger. Winter would kill them as surely as the infected if they couldn't find better shelter and more food. "Tell me about before," Amaranth whispered against Kestrel's shoulder. It was a ritual they had developed, sharing memories of the world that was as a way of keeping it alive. But today, the words felt heavier, more precious, as if they were handling artifacts from a lost civilization. Kestrel closed her eyes and tried to summon something beautiful from the past. "Saturday mornings," she said softly. "Coffee shops with long lines and people complaining about being late. The smell of fresh pastries and the sound of espresso machines. Everyone so busy, so worried about things that seemed important at the time." "Like what?" Amaranth asked, though she had heard this story before. The repetition was part of the comfort, a way of making the past feel real and solid. "Deadlines. Traffic. Whether your favorite show got renewed for another season." Kestrel's voice caught slightly. "We thought we had all the time in the world to figure things out, to become the people we wanted to be." In the distance, they could hear the infected still searching, their movements creating a rhythmic rustling through the underbrush. The sound reminded Kestrel of wind through wheat fields, another memory from a world where such simple beauties still existed. They were the ghosts now, she realized. The living had become specters haunting the ruins of their own civilization, while the dead inherited the earth. 3 hours passed before the forest fell silent again, the infected having finally given up their search and wandered back toward whatever compulsion drew them to the town square. In the hollow of the fallen tree, Kestrel's group waited until the shadows grew long and purple before daring to move. When they finally emerged, stiff and cold from their hiding place, the world seemed different somehow, more fragile, as if the very air around them was made of spun glass that might shatter at the wrong word. They moved deeper into the old-growth forest, where the canopy was so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. Here, in the perpetual twilight between the massive trunks, they found the remnants of what had once been a ranger station. The building was mostly collapsed, its roof caved in and walls covered with moss and creeping vines, but part of the foundation remained intact, creating a small shelter against the growing darkness. Senna collapsed against one of the moss-covered walls, her breathing still labored from their escape. The years before the outbreak had not been kind to her body. Desk jobs and processed food had left her unprepared for this new world of constant movement and physical demands. But she had something the others lacked, an encyclopedic knowledge of human behavior that came from 20 years as a social worker. She could read people in ways that sometimes meant the difference between finding allies and walking into traps. "We can't keep running like this," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Every time we encounter them, they seem more organized, more purposeful. It's like they're learning from each contact." Cicero was examining their remaining supplies, counting ammunition and measuring their food against the distance they still had to travel. His banker's mind still worked in calculations and risk assessments, but now the stakes were measured in lives rather than dollars. "Colorado is still 2 weeks away, minimum. That's assuming we don't hit any more delays." Thorne was cleaning his rifle with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that their life might depend on a weapon functioning perfectly. The teacher in him had adapted to this new reality by treating survival as a curriculum to be mastered, each lesson written in blood and carved into memory through repetition. "We need to find another way," he said without looking up from his work. "The main roads are too dangerous, and the back roads take too long." Amaranth sat apart from the others, her knees drawn up to her chest as she stared out into the darkening forest. At 15, she had spent more of her life in this broken world than in the one before, but she remembered fragments of childhood that seemed like dreams from another planet. Birthday parties with cake and candles. Christmas mornings with wrapped presents under a tree. The simple certainty that tomorrow would come and bring with it small joys and ordinary disappointments. "What if we're the last ones?" she asked suddenly, her voice so quiet they almost missed it. "What if there is no Colorado? What if we're just walking toward nothing?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They had all wondered the same thing during the dark hours before dawn, when hope felt as distant as the stars. The radio messages from Colorado had stopped 3 weeks ago, and every day that passed without contact made it more likely that their destination had fallen to the same fate as everywhere else. Kestrel moved to sit beside Amaranth, feeling the girl's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "Maybe we are," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. "Maybe Colorado is gone, and maybe we're walking into nothing. But the walking itself means something. It means we're still human, still choosing to hope even when hope doesn't make sense." She thought about Obsidian again, wondering where he was and whether he was still alive. His voice had been their lifeline for so long, a constant reminder that they weren't alone in the world. Without it, they felt cut off from everything except their own small circle of survival. But maybe that was enough. Maybe 4 people choosing to keep each other alive was its own kind of victory against the darkness. Night fell around them like a curtain, bringing with it the sounds of the forest adjusting to darkness. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the howl of wolves, real wolves, not the infected humans who sometimes made similar sounds. The natural world was already beginning to reclaim the spaces humans had abandoned, and Kestrel wondered what the earth would look like in 100 years, when the cities had crumbled and the roads were lost beneath grass and trees. "We should take turns keeping watch," Cicero said, though they all knew none of them would really sleep. Rest had become a luxury they couldn't afford, and their dreams, when they came, were filled with the faces of everyone they had lost along the way. As Kestrel settled in for what would be another long night of listening to every sound in the darkness, she realized that they had become their own kind of infected, carriers of memory, shambling through a dead world in search of something that might no longer exist. The only difference was that they still remembered what they were looking for. In the morning, They would continue walking the forgotten roads toward an uncertain destination, but for now, they were alive, and that would have to be enough. Dawn brought with it a discovery that changed everything. As they prepared to leave their shelter in the collapsed ranger station, Amaranth's sharp eyes caught sight of something glinting in the morning light. Half buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and forest debris, she had found a cache of emergency supplies, military rations, medical equipment, and most importantly, a working radio with fresh batteries. Thorn's hands trembled as he tuned through the static, searching for any sign of life in the endless sea of white noise. For long minutes, there was nothing but the hiss and crackle of empty frequencies. Then, cutting through the static like a knife through cloth, came a voice that made Kestrel's heart leap into her throat. "This is Obsidian, Mobile Command Post 77 Alpha, broadcasting on emergency frequency. If anyone is receiving this transmission, Colorado Safe Zone has been compromised. Repeat, Colorado Safe Zone has been compromised. Do not attempt to reach Denver. The infected have evolved." The words hit them like physical blows, each syllable destroying another piece of the hope they had carried across hundreds of miles. Senna sank to her knees in the moss and rotting leaves, her face gray with despair. They had walked through hell to reach a salvation that no longer existed, following roads that led nowhere, guided by promises that had turned to ash. But Obsidian's transmission wasn't finished. His voice continued through the static, carrying information that was both terrible and vital. New strain exhibits coordinated behavior, long-term memory retention, and basic problem-solving abilities. They're not just hunting anymore, they're planning. Eastern seaboard is lost. Recommend immediate evacuation to northern territories. Canada may still be viable. This is my final broadcast. Battery power critical. Good luck to anyone still out there. Remember what we were. The radio fell silent, leaving them alone with the weight of revelation. The infected they had encountered weren't an aberration, they were the future. Evolution had taken its course in the space of 2 years, transforming mindless predators into something far more dangerous. The rules of survival they had learned were already obsolete. How far to the Canadian border? Cicero asked, his voice mechanical as his mind shifted into planning mode. But they all knew the answer. From their current position in Oregon, it was at least 500 miles through increasingly hostile territory. Winter was coming, food was scarce, and now they faced enemies who could think and plan and remember. Amaranth was crying again, but this time her tears came with a terrible adult understanding of their situation. "We're going to die out here, aren't we?" she said, and the matter-of-fact tone of her voice was more heartbreaking than any sob. Kestrel looked at each of them in turn, Senna with her graying hair and worn hands, Cicero calculating impossible odds with the persistence of a man who had never learned to give up, Thorn clutching his rifle like a talisman against the darkness, and Amaranth, who deserved to grow up in a world where teenagers worried about homework and first dates instead of which direction to run when the dead came calling. "Maybe," Kestrel said, and the honesty felt like a gift she could give them. "Maybe we'll die on some forgotten road between here and there. Maybe we'll never see spring again, or safety, or any of the things we're walking toward." She paused, watching their faces in the dappled morning light. "But if we're going to die, let's die moving. Let's die choosing each other, choosing hope even when it's stupid, choosing to be human until the very end." They broke camp without another word, shouldering their packs and walking deeper into the forest. The roads they followed now weren't marked on any map, they were paths of necessity carved through wilderness by people who had learned that civilization was just another word for the temporary arrangement of hope and habit. Every step took them further from the world they had known and deeper into one where the only certainty was uncertainty. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sounds of pursuit beginning again. The infected from the town had found their trail, and this time they moved with purpose that spoke of intelligence rather than instinct. Mrs. Chen and her companions were no longer just hunting, they were tracking, learning, adapting to the behavior of their prey. But Kestrel and her group kept walking, because walking was what humans did. They put one foot in front of the other and moved toward tomorrow, even when tomorrow was uncertain. They carried with them the ghosts of who they had been and the fading echoes of the world that was, but they also carried something more precious, the stubborn refusal to stop being human, even in the face of a world that no longer had room for humanity. The forgotten road stretched ahead of them, leading through dust and echoes toward an ending none of them could see. Winter found them on a ridge overlooking what had once been the Columbia River Gorge, the water below reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. Snow had been falling for 3 days, and their tracks behind them told the story of their desperation, a wandering line of footprints that spoke of exhaustion and the gradual abandonment of hope. They had made it 50 miles north before the infected caught up to them again, and now they were being herded like animals toward some ending they couldn't yet see. Senna had fallen 2 miles back, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of months spent running from death. They had carried her as far as they could, but in the end, she had looked at them with eyes that held no fear, only gratitude, and asked them to leave her rifle and keep walking. Cicero had said a prayer over her body while Thorn carved her name into the bark of a maple tree, creating a monument that would outlast any marble headstone. Now there were 3 of them, and Amaranth could barely stand. The girl had grown from adolescence into something harder during their journey, but her body was failing even as her spirit remained unbroken. She moved like a sleepwalker, one foot following the other through pure mechanical persistence, her face gaunt with hunger and her eyes bright with fever. "There," Thorn said, pointing through the falling snow toward a structure on the far side of the ridge. It was an old fire lookout tower, its metal framework rising above the tree lean like a skeletal finger pointing toward heaven. "If we can reach it, we might be able to see what's ahead." Kestrel nodded, though she wondered what they hoped to see. The infected were maybe an hour behind them now, moving through the snow with the same relentless patience they had shown for weeks. She had counted at least 20 in their pursuing group, including Mrs. Chen, who seemed to have taken on some kind of leadership role among the dead. The floral dress was long gone, replaced by layers of clothing stripped from other victims, but her eyes remained fixed on Kestrel with an intensity that suggested memory, recognition, purpose. They climbed toward the tower through deepening snow, their breath forming clouds that dissipated instantly in the frigid air. Each step required tremendous effort, and Kestrel could feel her own strength failing. The rations had run out 3 days ago, and they had been living on pine needle tea and the occasional handful of berries. Their bodies were consuming themselves, burning muscle and hope in equal measure. The tower, when they reached it, was a ruin. Ice had brought down most of the stairs, and the cabin at the top swayed dangerously in the wind. But from the remaining platform, they could see for miles in every direction, an endless expanse of white forest broken only by the dark line of the river and the geometric scars where roads had once carried civilization through the wilderness. "Beautiful," Amaranth whispered, and Kestrel realized the girl was right. Stripped of human presence, the landscape had returned to something primal and pure. Snow covered the abandoned cars and empty towns, creating a clean slate where nature could begin again. It was the world as it had been before they came, and as it would be after they were gone. Below them, emerging from the forest like dark flowers blooming in snow, came the infected. They moved in formation now, spreading out to surround the base of the tower with tactical precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Mrs. Chen stood at their center, her face turned upward toward the platform where the 3 survivors waited. "She knows," Thorn said, his voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "She remembers us." Kestrel understood then that this had never been about reaching Colorado or Canada or any destination marked on a map. It had been about the journey itself, about the choice to keep walking even when walking led nowhere. They had carried the memory of humanity through a world that no longer needed it, and perhaps that was enough. She took Amaranth's hand and felt Thorn's fingers close around her other wrist. Together, they watched the sun set through the falling snow, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that would have been impossible to imagine in the before times. Below them, the infected waited with the patience of geology, content to let time and weather finish what they had started. "Tell me about before," Amaranth said one last time, her voice barely audible above the wind. Kestrel closed her eyes and summoned every beautiful ordinary moment she could remember, coffee shops and traffic jams, birthday parties and Monday morning meetings, all the small complaints and smaller joys that had made up a life. She spoke them into the gathering darkness like prayers, offering them to the snow and wind and the patient dead below. When morning came, the tower stood empty above the frozen forest, and the infected had already begun their slow migration toward whatever new purpose called them. But something remained in that place, an echo of voices that had refused to be silenced, a whisper of memory that would outlast the winter and the spring that followed. The forgotten roads they had walked led through dust and echoes and the ghosts of what they were, but in the end, they had remembered. And perhaps, in a world where memory itself had become an act of rebellion, that was the only victory left to claim.